All right, we're going to take a quick look through some of the issues with the growing cities in the U.S. during the Gilded Age. We're going to focus mostly on the poorer sections of the city. So the poor tended to live in the city center. That was mostly due to the fact that that's where the jobs were. This is before public transportation, a lot of developments in public transportation, and certainly they wouldn't have had any private transportation. There were no cars, and they couldn't afford them anyway, even if they did exist. So they had to live near where they worked, and a lot of companies actually built apartment or tenement buildings next to the factory for their workers to work in. And they tended to pay a lot for that, just because they didn't have a whole lot of other options. So the kinds of dwellings we're talking about here, we're going to refer to as tenements. And so these are crowded, poorly built, poorly maintained, oftentimes kind of expensive relative to their income apartments during the Gilded Age. And we're going to talk a lot about what those look like. So there's a tenement district in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the late 1800s. And the first thing I always notice when I look at this is how crowded it is. You notice people standing in the streets, and why is that? Well, there's no cars, so you can get out of the way of a horse and carriage, but cars are a little tougher. That's why, people kind of hung around in the streets there. You see the buildings, pretty tall, or actually pretty short. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories here. You couldn't build a building super tall because before the Bessemer process and the abundance of steel, the iron that was used for these buildings wasn't strong enough to support a super tall building. And otherwise, you'd have to make up the difference with bricks on the outside, in which case you wouldn't have room for windows, which you needed for light and ventilation and all of that. Plus, there were no elevators, so what are you going to walk up 12 flights every day? Probably not. So buildings are pretty short. Which meant that the tenements themselves were pretty small, so that people could be crammed in there because the population was exploding, as we know. So it was pretty crowded, pretty tight. For example, in this picture, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in a really small space. There would have been a little bit more to this, but not a ton. And you see 2 beds here right next to or across from the stove. Which might have been nice in the winter, would have made it toasty warm, but with a coal burning stove, or even if it was a wood burning stove, which I guess it wouldn't have been, would have been tough to keep things clean. Would have been pretty dark. You see this woman probably took in somebody else's wash, which was a big job, but doing somebody else's wash for some extra money. The hallways were also dark. There's obstacles all over the place. Children kind of wandering around, which you'll read about later. And this would have been for the water. One source of water, maybe one toilet in a hallway in the closet for everybody to use. So in apartment and tenement, plumbing was not available at first until the city started to make some changes towards the beginning of the 1900s. There's a lot of city services that we take for granted today, one being trash collection, but that didn't always exist. And as cities started to grow, trash started to pile up, and before cities took care of that as part of as part of their efforts to clean things up, things got really messy, and you just threw your trash out, you threw your waste out wherever it would go. So on the street, in the alleys, in the basement here, and that's obviously really messy and unattractive, but also would breed disease, and you can imagine the rats running through there. So it's a health risk with things being that messy. In an early attempt to try and reform these tenements, one of the methods was what's called a dumbbell tenement, and you can see it's kind of shaped like a dumbbell. That's why it's called that. But the whole idea here is this air shaft in the middle. This is called the air shaft. It's basically a big hole in the center of the building. And if a similar building was built on the other side of either one of these that was shaped the same way, it would create another air shaft. so that these interior rooms could have windows, access to light, access to fresh air, whereas otherwise they would be totally closed in. So it's a good idea, but we're going to see that it presented some problems. So if it's designed to be a source of light and fresh air, you can see here that wasn't always the case. Um, and obviously here's another picture. And as you read the tenement testimony here in a minute, I just wanted you to have a visual of what the air shaft looked like. For the not desperately poor, there's the next zone out. So if the poor in the city center, you move out from that, you know, what's called the zone of emergence. There are those people kind of working their way up, maybe developed a skill or have a talent of some kind. Certain factory workers, maybe skilled factory workers, professional mechanics, people who knew not just didn't have to just do the menial assembly line work, but could do other things as well. Um, so the benefit here is that the housing was nicer, not super nice, but nicer. The danger is that it could still slip back into poverty, so that that reality existed for these individuals. We're not going to talk a ton about the middle class because you're going to see that in the 1900 house video. But houses with multiple levels, rooms. One of the things that separated the middle class from the lower class is the middle class had disposable income for things like decorations and maybe vacations and trips and entertainment and leisure. And they would have tried to make it very clear that they weren't poor. So it did look quite a bit different. And we're not really going to talk about the rich stuff at all because you kind of know what that looks like. Everybody's seen a mansion. So anyway, that the tenements, the idea of tenements, the idea of how people lived and were, in a lot of cases were forced to live during the Gilded Age is a really important one. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know.